They called him the Godfather of Godfathers, the man who ruled America's mafia with silence, strategy, and absolute control. While other mobsters bathed in blood and chaos, Carlo Gambino built an empire from the shadows. He never raised his voice, yet every word he spoke could change lives, or end them. For decades, he controlled the 5 families of New York. Politicians whispered his name behind closed doors, and businessmen feared losing everything with one wrong move. But while Gambino lived like a ghost, the FBI was watching, determined to bring down the quiet Don who seemed untouchable. Every conversation, every deal, every suspicious death led back to him. Yet, there was never enough proof. Behind the calm face of a devoted family man hid the most calculating criminal mind in American history. This is the story of the FBI's most frustrating case, the relentless pursuit of a mafia boss who never left a trace, never made a mistake, and took his secrets to the grave. Carlo Gambino wasn't born into power. He built it, piece by piece, with silence as his greatest weapon. Born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1902, Gambino arrived in America as a poor immigrant with nothing but ambition and a deep understanding of how the mafia worked. While others made headlines with violence and arrogance, Carlo moved quietly, learning, observing, and waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that real power didn't come from fear alone. It came from patience, loyalty, and respect. By the time most mobsters were fighting for territory, Gambino was already building alliances that would make him untouchable. When he took over the family in 1957, after the shocking barbershop murder of Albert Anastasia, everything changed. Under Gambino's rule, the mafia evolved into a business empire. He controlled unions, construction companies, ports, and gambling operations from coast to coast, all while avoiding public attention. But with every dollar earned and every rival eliminated, the FBI grew more obsessed. They couldn't understand how one man could control so much without ever being caught. He didn't drink, didn't boast, and never left a trail. To the world, he was a calm, polite gentleman. But behind that mask was the mastermind of America's most powerful criminal empire. For the FBI, this wasn't just a case. It was personal. Bringing down Carlo Gambino meant proving that no one was above the law. Yet, as years passed and investigations failed, one truth became clear. Gambino wasn't just ahead of his time. He was untouchable. Carlo Gambino's rise wasn't built on violence. It was built on intelligence, patience, and silence. Born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1902, Gambino grew up surrounded by the old traditions of Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. From a young age, he learned that survival meant knowing when to speak and when to disappear. By the time he was 19, the mafia had already marked him as someone destined for leadership. When he arrived in New York in 1921, America was a land of opportunity and chaos. Prohibition had just begun, and alcohol was illegal. But for the mafia, it was a golden age. Bootlegging turned small-time criminals into millionaires, and violence ruled the streets. Gambino joined the D'Aquila crime family, working quietly behind the scenes. While others fought over power, Gambino studied the system, learning who to trust, who to bribe, and who to eliminate. When his boss, Salvatore D'Aquila, was assassinated in 1928, most expected the family to fall apart. But Gambino aligned himself with Lucky Luciano, the brilliant architect who restructured the mafia into the 5 families of New York. This move changed everything. Luciano saw in Carlo what others missed, a man who could think 3 steps ahead. Together, they transformed organized crime into a national network of power and profit. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Gambino quietly built his wealth through illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and control over the city's ports. He avoided attention, rarely appeared in photographs, and never left evidence behind. His secret? Always let others take the spotlight. And the fall. When Albert Anastasia, the ruthless leader of Murder, Inc., became boss of the family, Gambino stayed close, pretending loyalty. But in 1957, when Anastasia was shot dead in a Manhattan barber shop, Gambino took over. No fanfare, no bloodshed, just strategy. That same year, law enforcement began to hear whispers that the man who now controlled New York's most powerful mafia family didn't need to shout to command respect. With calm eyes and a soft voice, Carlo Gambino had become the undisputed godfather of American organized crime. Under his rule, chaos became order. Violence gave way to diplomacy. He established peace among the five families, forming secret alliances that would last decades. But while Gambino brought stability to the underworld, the FBI was beginning to notice his quiet rise. Agents couldn't understand how this unassuming man who lived modestly in Brooklyn and drove his own car could possibly be the head of a billion-dollar empire. But Gambino had mastered invisibility. No recordings, no witnesses, no mistakes. By the end of the 1950s, his network extended from New York to Chicago and even into Las Vegas. He had infiltrated unions, shipping docks, and construction companies, turning every corner of the American economy into a tool of power. Yet, despite his growing control, his name remained hidden from the public eye. While other mobsters became legends through fear, Carlo Gambino built his through silence. He was the calm within the storm. And soon, even the FBI would realize that taking him down would be unlike any case they had ever faced. By the early 1960s, the FBI had turned its full attention toward one man, Carlo Gambino. To the public, he was a polite, soft-spoken businessman, but to law enforcement, he was the shadow behind every major mafia decision in America. The Bureau knew he was pulling the strings, controlling the ports, manipulating labor unions, deciding who lived and who died. Yet they couldn't find a single piece of evidence strong enough to convict him. For decades, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had refused to even acknowledge the existence of organized crime. But after the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting, where over 60 mob leaders were caught by surprise in a small town in New York, Hoover could no longer deny it. Among the names whispered that night, one stood out: Carlo Gambino. Unlike the others, he wasn't there. He had known better. That absence alone told the FBI everything they needed to know. Gambino was smarter than the rest. From that moment, the FBI made him their #1 target. Agents began monitoring phone lines, trailing his associates, and bugging restaurants known for mob meetings. But Gambino was a ghost. He never used phones for business, never discussed crime directly, and rarely met with outsiders. Every conversation went through layers of trusted captains, making it nearly impossible to trace anything back to him. The Bureau's frustration grew with every failed attempt. Time after time, operations would collapse due to lack of evidence or sudden leaks that tipped off the mob. Someone, somewhere, was protecting Gambino. The FBI began to realize they weren't just chasing a criminal. They were fighting a system built on loyalty, money, and fear. Inside the Bureau, a specialized task force was formed solely to dismantle the Gambino empire. Dozens of agents worked around the clock, piecing together financial records, surveillance photos, and wiretaps. But Gambino's genius was his simplicity. He lived in a modest house in Brooklyn, drove an old car, and attended church regularly. To the world, he appeared as nothing more than a quiet family man. Even when law enforcement tried to corner him with tax charges or labor racketeering cases, Carlo would smile calmly, deny everything, and walk away untouched. He never raised his voice. He never lost his composure. It was as if he knew exactly what the FBI would do, before they did it. Meanwhile, the Mafia continued to flourish under his leadership. Gambino's influence reached into the police, local government, and even business circles. Union leaders took orders from him. Dock workers followed his rules. The flow of money through his rackets was staggering, yet every trace of it was buried beneath layers of legitimate business. By the late 1960s, the FBI's frustration had turned into obsession. Agents called him the Phantom Don, because no one could catch him doing anything illegal. But Gambino's quiet smile was deceiving. Behind the calm exterior, he was fully aware of every move the Bureau made. He had men watching the watchers. Every time the FBI thought they were closing in, he vanished from sight, untouchable once again. For Hoover's FBI, it became a battle of patience, law enforcement's persistence against Gambino's discipline. And in this silent war, it was always Carlo who stayed one step ahead. By the early 1970s, the FBI was desperate. Years of surveillance, stakeouts, and interrogations had yielded almost nothing. Carlo Gambino remained an invisible empire. No fingerprints, no recordings, no direct witnesses. Agents knew the Mafia's heartbeat pulsed through his orders, but without proof, he was untouchable. So the Bureau made a decision. If they couldn't catch him directly, they'd listen to the world around him. That's when the wiretaps began. The FBI planted bugs in social clubs, restaurants, and offices across New York. Every Mafia hotspot became a potential listening post. The most important of these was the Ravenite Social Club, a modest brick building in Little Italy where many of Gambino's lieutenants met. Agents worked nights to hide microphones inside walls, ceilings, even telephones. Every whispered conversation was recorded, every coded phrase analyzed. But Gambino was no ordinary boss. He rarely visited public spots and almost never spoke about business. His orders traveled through layers of intermediaries, soldiers, captains, and consiglieres, each sworn to silence. When agents listened to hundreds of hours of tapes, all they heard were harmless conversations. Talk about family, weather, sports. Gambino's system of communication was nearly perfect, a code of invisibility no technology could break. To strengthen their case, the FBI began turning small-time mobsters into informants. Low-level members caught in gambling or extortion cases were offered deals, freedom for information. Some talked. They described Gambino as a ghost, a man so careful that even his closest associates didn't fully understand how much power he truly had. "You don't meet the boss," one informant said. "The boss meets you, if you're lucky." Still, progress was slow. Every time an informant got close, they vanished, either silenced by fear or found dead under mysterious circumstances. The Bureau realized that Gambino's power wasn't just built on fear. It was built on loyalty so deep it bordered on religion. Betraying Carlo was like betraying your own blood. Then came the biggest break. In 1972, a secret informant working in the garment industry exposed a vast extortion network tied directly to Gambino's family. Millions were flowing from clothing factories to mob-controlled unions. It was the financial engine of Gambino's empire. The FBI moved quickly. Raids, arrests, documents seized. For the first time, they believed they had him. But just as the case neared completion, something went wrong. Key evidence disappeared. Recordings were mysteriously damaged. Witnesses changed their statements or went missing. Even some prosecutors began backing away under political pressure. Someone powerful was pulling strings behind the scenes, protecting the most dangerous man in America. It became clear to the FBI that they weren't just fighting a mafia family. They were fighting corruption woven deep into the fabric of American society. Gambino had friends in high places, business leaders, judges, even law enforcement officers who owed him favors. Despite their failures, agents refused to give up. The Bureau intensified its pursuit, expanding investigations nationwide. But Gambino was always 3 steps ahead. He anticipated raids, evaded surveillance, and dismantled threats before they even surfaced. By the end of the decade, the FBI had spent millions trying to bring down one man, yet Carlo Gambino remained free. Not because he was lucky, but because he understood one truth better than anyone else. Power doesn't shout, it whispers. By the mid-1970s, time was finally catching up with Carlo Gambino. He was in his 70s now, older, slower, and suffering from heart problems. But even as his health faded, his control over the mafia remained unshaken. He ruled from the comfort of his modest Brooklyn home, issuing orders through trusted captains who still treated his every word like law. To his enemies, he was the ghost who refused to die. To the FBI, he was the case that refused to close. Agents believed Gambino's age would make him vulnerable. They thought he'd slip up, say something, trust the wrong person, make one mistake. But the Don who built his empire on silence wasn't about to break his code now. Even as wiretaps and surveillance teams surrounded his world, Gambino remained unbothered. He kept a small circle, avoided luxury, and rarely appeared in public. His calm composure made him untouchable, even in frailty. In 1972, a violent power struggle within the mafia gave the FBI new hope. An assassination attempt targeted his nephew and future heir, Paul Castellano, sending shockwaves through the underworld. Federal agents thought the chaos would expose weaknesses in Gambino's empire, perhaps lead to betrayal or rebellion. Instead, Carlo used the crisis to tighten his grip. He eliminated internal threats quietly and promoted loyal soldiers who would protect his legacy long after he was gone. Meanwhile, the Bureau ramped up efforts to finally trap him. New task forces were created, focusing on his financial empire, labor unions, construction, ports, and gambling. But every trail led to dead ends. The FBI had mountains of data and thousands of hours of tapes, yet no single line of evidence directly tied Gambino to criminal activity. It was as if the mafia, on October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died peacefully at his home in Massapequa, Long Island, surrounded by family, untouched by law, and undefeated by his enemies. No gunfire, no police raid, no betrayal. The man who built America's most powerful crime empire slipped away quietly, just as he had lived. To the FBI, it felt like the closing of a book that had no ending. They had spent decades chasing him, but never once could they prove his guilt. He was, until his final breath, the ultimate symbol of criminal perfection. Gambino's funeral was a spectacle of silence. Hundreds attended, yet few dared speak. Among the mourners were businessmen, politicians, union leaders, people who owed their fortunes and perhaps their lives to the man in the coffin. The Bureau watched from a distance, taking photographs, noting every face. They saw what they had always feared. Gambino's empire wasn't dying with him. It was evolving. Paul Castellano, his chosen successor, would take control of the family. But what Gambino left behind was more than a criminal organization. It was a philosophy. His code became law in the underworld. Never act out of anger. Never seek attention. Power is best when unseen. Under his rule, the mafia had operated like a corporation. Every decision was strategic, every action calculated for long-term gain. Even when violence was necessary, it was clean, efficient, and hidden from the public eye. The FBI files revealed a chilling truth. Gambino had turned organized crime into a business model that outlived him. But his genius came with a curse. After his death, his successors tried to follow his rules but lacked his discipline. Paul Castellano grew arrogant, drawing too much attention to his wealth. John Gotti sought fame instead of control, turning the once invisible family into front-page headlines. And with that fame came downfall. The very secrecy that had protected Gambino's empire vanished, and soon the FBI would finally claim victory, years too late. Yet even with Gotti's arrest and Castellano's assassination, one fact never changed. No one ever beat the system like Carlo Gambino. He had turned invisibility into power. He had outsmarted the law, outlived his rivals, and reshaped the mafia into something bigger than any single man. To this day, his name carries an aura of fear and respect, not because of brutality, but because of control. He proved that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who scream, threaten, or kill in daylight. They're the ones who smile, wait, and never leave a trace. For the FBI, Gambino's case remains one of the greatest frustrations in American history. Thousands of pages, millions of dollars, and years of surveillance. And yet, no conviction. He had beaten them at their own game. Carlo Gambino's legend didn't end with his death. It became a lesson. For the underworld, a guide to power. For law enforcement, a warning of how silence can rule a nation. His shadow still lingers over the mafia world, calm, calculating, and untouchable.